Anyways, exciting.
All right, I want to get started. I'm thrilled to see such a good turnout here. I always worry that with all the security arrangements that we won't get a decent turnout, but this is great. Bilahari draws a good audience. So first I want to say I'm Andy Nathan. I'm a professor of political science. I'm in the Weatherhead East Asian Institute. Second thing is I want to introduce the Borton Mosley lecture series briefly. Hugh Borton was one of the founders of what was then called the East Asian Institute. He was a Japan specialist. Now we're called the Weatherhead East Asian Institute. He had a distinguished career studying Japan. He participated in the key decisions of the occupation after World War II in Japan about keeping the emperor in place, revising the constitution, and so on, and then came back to Columbia, helped to found the East Asian Institute and develop Japan studies at Columbia. And then when he retired from Columbia, he went and served as the president of Haverford College before retiring finally to a life as a farmer for a period of time. Philip Mosley was a key figure in the creation of what was then called the Russian Institute with an N, which is now the Harriman Institute. He was the Adlai Stevenson Professor of International Relations at Columbia, and besides his teaching career at Columbia, played a huge role in the State Department as an advisor and in the Council on Foreign Relations with Foreign Affairs magazine. The third thing I want to do is to introduce Alex Cooley, who's sitting here, who has long CV, many important books and important contributions. But the main thing to be said here is that he's a former director of the Harriman Institute, and he's a professor of political science at Barnard and the associate provost of what? Oh my damn, so many things. And a very important dude around the campus. And then, so now it's my great pleasure to introduce Bilahari Kausikan, an old, wonderful friend with a great sense of humor, among other things, and tremendous insight into international affairs. So Bilahari was at Columbia as a student in political science when?
77, 78 to 81.
Man, so I was here then. But you never... And he went all the way up to starting his dissertation, and then the light bulb went on in his head, and he's like, what the hell am I doing here? And he went back to Singapore and served in Washington, D.C. in a junior position. So the reason he was never ambassador to the United States was that he had already been to D.C. and realized he didn't want to go back there. But he served as the ambassador to Russia, where he told me it was a much easier job because they never told you anything in Russia. And he was Singapore's permanent representative to the United Nations. So New York was okay, DC not okay, but New York okay. And he ended his diplomatic career as permanent secretary of the Singapore Foreign Ministry, which is the smartest foreign ministry in the world. It's a small one, but the people are the smartest. And Bilahari promoted and cultivated the careers of a lot of those smart people in that ministry as the Perm Sec. And Singapore also has a smart foreign policy that he helped to shape. And then after retiring from the foreign ministry, he served as the chairperson of the Middle East Institute at the National University of Singapore. So when he travels, he often travels to the Middle East as well as to the United States and around Asia and in Europe and Antarctica and in the Arctic and Greenland. And he goes everywhere. And he publishes... He publishes a great deal. You'll see a lot of his articles in Foreign Affairs and in the Straits Times and everywhere else. So we are just so happy to have, and this happens to be a very good time to have somebody who's smart and understands the whole world. And so we're going to ask him to give some remarks, and then Alex and I will sit on either side of him and try to embarrass him. But we will fail in that endeavor. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. That was perhaps too kind an introduction. Let me just turn this on. Many people have tried to embarrass me in my career, but they have found out that one of the qualities of being a diplomat, and particularly a Singapore diplomat, is to develop an extremely thick skin. So they have all failed. So let's see what happens tonight. Now, I've entitled my talk, The Cold War, Sino-Soviet Rivalry, and the Making and Possibly Unmaking of Southeast Asia. I'll take about 35 or so minutes, and then let's have a discussion. So let me get straight into it. And let me start with a story. In the late 1970s, thanks to the generosity of the American taxpayers, for which I will always be grateful, I arrived at Columbia University, resolved on pursuing a PhD on the foreign policy of the Soviet Union, the then Soviet Union. To supervise my studies, the university had assigned me to a very distinguished scholar. I don't remember whether we had our first meeting in what was then called the Russian Institute, but I do vividly remember that the meeting did not go well. He asked what aspect of Soviet foreign policy interested me, but hardly had I finished replying, the echoes of my words still reverberating in the air, when he dismissed my interest as completely inconsequential. And every attempt to persuade him otherwise was completely ignored. Ignored, huh? Not even brushed aside, just ignored. Now, clearly this relationship was not going to work. So I took myself off to the East Asian Institute, where another distinguished scholar had his lair. And he was the author of a book about the Japanese intervention in Siberia after the First World War that I remembered reading as an undergraduate at what was then the University of Singapore, now called the National University of Singapore. And I brashly asked him, cold, it was a cold call, to be my supervisor. That scholar was the late James Morley, which many of you know. I don't know why he agreed to take me on, and I rather regret not asking him when I got to know him as a friend when I was posted to New York as our representative to the United Nations. But perhaps his fancy was tickled when someone from Singapore had read his book, which had been published as a study of the Russian Institute, about 20 years before I barged into his office. Because I recall Professor Morley asking me if his book was prescribed reading for any course at the University of Singapore. It wasn't. I chanced upon it when browsing around in the stacks, when I should have been studying something else. Now, the topic that had been so abruptly dismissed years ago was Soviet policy towards ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. I never finished more than 2 chapters on my dissertation, but I still think it was not an inconsequential subject. Perhaps in the larger scheme of things at that time, Soviet policy towards ASEAN was indeed not a first-order issue, because Cold War dynamics had been profoundly modified by the US rapprochement with China, and important nuclear arms control agreements was being negotiated between the US and the Soviet Union. But as I vainly attempted to explain, it was not inconsequential to the peoples of Southeast Asia. And too much analysis of Southeast Asia forgets that it is not an uninhabited region. We live there. I am therefore delighted and deeply honored to have been given this opportunity to at last share my views on the significance of the Cold War in shaping the idea of Southeast Asia with a more or less captive Columbia University audience. I only hope that having listened to me, you do not conclude that inviting me to deliver the 2025 Borton Mosley Lecture was an act of reckless folly. Now, Southeast Asia is not a natural region, by which I mean an area that can be defined by something intrinsic to itself. The only thing intrinsic to Southeast Asia is its great diversity. And that's just another way of saying that there is nothing intrinsic to itself. Of course, there were ancient patterns of trade and other interactions linking the various peoples and polities that existed in what we now call Southeast Asia. But by the end of the 19th century, these had all been disrupted, if not completely destroyed, as the entire region had fallen under colonial rule. Thailand remained formally independent, but it actually, at first Britain and then the United States called the shots there. The colonial authorities, as a matter of policy, kept their imperial possessions separate and minimized contacts between their subjects. None of the imperial powers conceptualized their territories, the territories they control, as being Southeast Asian. And the term Southeast Asia gained currency only after the strategic imperative of recapturing the territories under occupation by Imperial Japan arose during the Second World War. This was the first time that the entire area had fallen under a single authority, and if you're going to recapture it, you had to conceptualize it more or less holistically too. But even then, Southeast Asia Command was based in Colombo, in Sri Lanka. And it did not include all the territories we now understand as Southeast Asia. And the Southeast Asia commander, Lord Mountbatten, never exercised command over all Allied forces within the area. So even as a geopolitical concept forged in the furnace of war, Southeast Asia was not entirely coherent. It is still not an entirely coherent geopolitical concept, or at least it is still a work in progress and perhaps will always be a work in progress. Although it is now generally accepted that Southeast Asia is defined by the 10 members of ASEAN, there is still some fuzziness at its edges. Southeast Asia will also include Timor-Leste when it is formally admitted to ASEAN. It is now only an observer. But there is still some debate over the timing and conditions of its membership. On the other hand, Papua New Guinea has been an observer in ASEAN since 1976. But there is a firm consensus that it will never be admitted as a member. And as I will explain later, that there may be some reason to believe that membership of ASEAN, as that the importance of membership of ASEAN in the definition of Southeast Asia may not be the last word on what is Southeast Asia. Now, ASEAN and the idea of Southeast Asia it encompassed did not spring out Athena-like, fully formed in 1967 from the brows of its founding fathers. It emerged only after many hesitations and meanderings through the tangled and interrelated processes of post-war decolonization and the dynamics of Cold War rivalries between the US, the Soviet Union, and the People's Republic of China as they played out in that area, in our area. It's going to be very tiresome to you and to me for me to recount every step of the complicated and convoluted diplomatic maneuvers of the 1950s through the 1960s, whereby various not always compatible ideas of regionalism were floated, competed, and coexisted, influenced or displaced each other before ASEAN finally emerged. A sampling of the names of the various experiments will, however, give you a flavor. The Pacific Pact, the Asia-Pacific Council, the Ministerial Conference on Economic Development of Southeast Asia, the Southeast Asia Friendship and Economic Treaty, Mafalindo, the Association of Southeast Asia. There were a few more, but they're even more obscure. Some of these were initiated outside Southeast Asia and included countries from Northeast Asia and Taiwan, as well as Australia and New Zealand. None of these included all the countries we now consider Southeast Asian, and some of these experiments lasted well into the 1970s after ASEAN was formed. For at least a decade after 1967, it was not at all clear, both to its members and to external powers with interest in Southeast Asia, that ASEAN would not go the way of these earlier experiments. All these earlier experiments have long been forgotten. They are worth mentioning only to underscore that there was nothing inevitable about ASEAN's emergence. Its founding members were divided over some very fundamental issues. But what is most striking about the tortuous processes leading to ASEAN's formation and its fragile first decade is that the aspiration to regional organization of some sort may have on occasion faltered but never disappeared. Regionalism was always regarded as an important tool enabling weak countries of Southeast Asia, living amidst the rivalries of major powers, some measure of voice and agency. It's worth reminding ourselves that while the primary focus of the Cold War was in Europe, in Asia the Cold War was far from cold. It was hot in Korea and in Indochina, and that conflicts in Indochina continued through the 1980s, driven by Sino-Soviet rivalry, long after US-Soviet relations had stabilized in Europe. Now, buttressing the determination to preserve voice and agency was what has proven to be the most powerful force in Southeast Asia since the mid-20th century. That is nationalism. Nationalism defeated colonialism, shaped ideologies of both left and right, and with two very tragic exceptions, only two very tragic exceptions, enabled the countries of Southeast Asia to successfully navigate the risks and uncertainties of the Cold War. Trying to define your own region through regional organization was a way of asserting agency over your own destiny, rather than allowing the rivalries of external powers to shape your region and determine your future. The major powers, of course, had their own preferred notions of regional order, and since the 1950s deployed proxies to advance them. But no external power has ever been able to shape the Southeast Asian regional architecture entirely in accordance with their preferences. Even former American treaty allies, the Philippines and Thailand, had reservations about American ideas of what constituted a desirable regional architecture and sought maneuver space to pursue their own ideas. The Philippines, for example, used regionalism to stress its Asian identity, perhaps due to the anti-American streak in Filipino nationalism. Thailand too had its own ideas about regionalism, perhaps to obscure that it had been an ally of Imperial Japan during the Second World War, and only American intervention saved it from retribution from the returning European powers. Southeast Asia was and remains too complex and diverse a region to be captured whole. The preferred American concept of regional order, SEATO, Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, had only two Southeast Asian members, Thailand and the Philippines, and never took off. Britain, the principal US deputy, had more experience dealing with Southeast Asian realities and took a more eclectic approach, encouraging any regional experiment that showed any promise of promoting stability. After SEATO clearly failed, and in particular the war in Vietnam proved unwinnable and not worth the candle, the US too eventually came around to supporting ASEAN, albeit initially without any great enthusiasm. American attitudes towards ASEAN have never been without some degree of ambivalence across many different administrations. Skepticism about multilateralism, whether regional or global, and a preference for bilateralism, which maximizes American leverage, were not recent inventions of President Donald Trump. An interesting footnote. It was an American academic, Russell H. Fifield, of the University of Michigan, a specialist in US policy towards Southeast Asia, who in a 1963 publication for the Council on Foreign Relations, 4 years before ASEAN was formed, realized that any tight NATO-like organization would never attract sufficient regional support, and proposed instead a looser structure, which he suggested should be called, guess what? The Association of Southeast Asian Nations. At their first meeting in 1967, the ASEAN foreign ministers acknowledged Fifield's contribution. Now, the focal points of Soviet and Chinese efforts in Southeast Asia were North Vietnam, which dreamt of an Indochina Federation under its control, and Sukarno's Indonesia, in which the Partai Komunis Indonesia, PKI, Indonesian Communist Party, was exercising growing influence, which gave a leftist cast to Sukarno's idea of Indonesia Raya, Greater Indonesia, covering most of what is in Malay called Alam Melayu, or the Malay world. Moscow and Beijing competed for influence in both North Vietnam and Indonesia. The Soviet Union was generous in providing military supplies to both North Vietnam and Sukarno's Indonesia. Mao's China has had less material resources to offer, but we now know that more than 400,000 volunteers in inverted commas, from the People's Liberation Army and related organizations served in Indochina. There were perhaps only 5,000 or 6,000 Soviet advisors. But both the Soviet Union and China were ultimately disappointed. The PKI moved towards Beijing, and after its victory over the South, Hanoi turned to the Soviet Union. Cold War dynamics were, of course, not the only consideration for Southeast Asian advocates of regionalism. I had earlier mentioned that Southeast Asia can only be characterized by its diversity, but these are not ordinary diversities or ordinary differences of, say, the level of economic development or political structure. The key diversities are primordial differences of race, of language, and of religion, and these define core identities. Nationalisms infused with race, language, and religion, nationalisms, the plural is crucial, divided the newly independent countries of Southeast Asia as much as their nationalisms provided a common desire to maintain autonomy amidst Cold War competition. Race, language, and religion are closely correlated in Southeast Asia and are still central to the domestic politics of the countries of the region as well as to intra-regional dynamics. It makes for a complex and confusing mosaic of motivations and sensitivities, all the more so in the 1950s and 1960s, when nationalisms were still young and tender, quick to take offense. Now, time and the accumulated experience of working together has taken some of the rawness of the tensions that inevitably arise when core identities rub up against each other. But the identities themselves, and hence the potential for conflict, will never disappear. They lurk not very far beneath the surface of diplomatic polities and need constant management. And this prescribes what was and remains ASEAN's primary function, the management of relationships among its members in a region where stability or even civility in relationships cannot be taken for granted. Or to put it more colloquially or more vividly, we are not a happy band of brothers singing in perfect harmony. If we were indeed a happy band of brothers singing in harmony, there would be no need for ASEAN. Now, each of these two broad considerations, dealing with Cold War competition and managing intra-regional relationships, eventually came to be seen as the necessary condition for achieving the other. Stabilizing regional relationships would minimize opportunities for major powers to exploit intra-regional divisions and compromise the autonomy of all. After ASEAN was formed, the Indonesians had a slogan that captured the essential idea. National resilience enhances regional resilience, and regional resilience enhances national resilience. Autonomy was the one value that all Southeast Asian nationalists, regardless of their other differences, could all agree on. Southeast Asian countries were all interested in regionalism as a means of maintaining their autonomy. But at the same time, their competing nationalisms, different ideas of regionalism, and their different strategies to put their ideas into practice ultimately sunk all the early experiments at regionalism, whose names I read out at the beginning. You might call this the paradox of diversity. Diversity makes regionalism simultaneously more necessary and more difficult to achieve. There was often not even agreement on which countries should be included in the different early proposals. However, by the mid-1960s, these broad factors, Cold War dynamics and mutually suspicious nationalisms, had coalesced into two interrelated problems. How to deal with the largest country in Southeast Asia, Indonesia, and how to deal with the smallest country in Southeast Asia, Singapore. Both in their own ways were outliers and aroused suspicions. Singapore is a majority ethnic Chinese country in a region where ethnic Chinese are a not always welcomed minority. In 1965, Singapore had been forced to leave Malaysia because of the suspicions of the Malay political leaders that we wanted to replace their idea of a Malaysia based on Ketuanan Melayu, Malay dominance, although I think it's better translated as Malay overlordship, with a Malaysia based on multiracial equality, which was Singapore's idea. Racial and ideological fears melded to concerns that newly independent Singapore would become a stalking horse for China. An anxiety that was stoked by the fact that Singapore's merger with Malaya to form Malaysia was strongly opposed by the China-supported Malayan Communist Party, or MCP. And merger had entailed close-run political battles between the PAP, which is still Singapore's ruling party, and China's United Front proxies. In 1965, when we had independence thrust upon us, the Malayan Communist Party underground was still active in Singapore and continued to be active through the 1970s. That decade is usually remembered as a period of fast growth for Singapore. But MCP bombs went off in Singapore as late as 1974, and it was a much more volatile period than generally thought. China and the Soviet Union had both denounced Malaysia as a neo-imperialist plot designed to perpetuate Western sway over Southeast Asia. Sukarno's Indonesia echoed Beijing and Moscow. The Philippines also criticized the proposed incorporation of North Borneo, over which it had claims it's now the East Malaysian state of Sabah, into Malaysia. In 1963, Sukarno launched confrontation, a tactic he had used successfully against Dutch New Guinea, to, as he put it, ganyang, meaning crush Malaysia. Confrontasi was an undeclared war fought from 1963 to 1966 against Malaysia, and after Singapore left Malaysia in 1965, against us as well. Sukarno's removal from power after the PKI's failed China-supported coup that same year, 1965, opened the way to wind down confrontasi. Suharto's new order, Suharto was Sukarno's successor. It's a bit confusing for you who don't know Indonesia well because the names are very similar. Suharto, Sukarno. Remember that. When Suharto's new order was still strongly committed to the kind of entitled nationalism that had been among the primary causes of confrontasi. That phrase I just used, entitled nationalism, is that of a very distinguished scholar of Southeast Asia, George McTernan Cahen, who used it when writing contemporaneously about confrontasi. And it refers to the belief in Indonesia that because of its size and because it had gained independence through revolution, rather than granted it peacefully like Malaya, Indonesia was entitled to determine the shape of the regional order and lead Southeast Asia. Although a man of the right rather than the left, Suharto was no less a nationalist than Sukarno. He was no less committed to a free bebas dan active foreign policy and had no less strong a belief in Indonesia's right to lead. But Suharto's new order chose to pursue Indonesia's leadership ambitions through focusing its nationalism on economic development rather than living dangerously, which is what Suharto claimed to be doing. Now, ASEAN succeeded primarily due to the difference between Suharto's Indonesia and Sukarno's Indonesia. But regardless of who ruled in Jakarta, due to the vast imbalance of size between Indonesia and the rest of Southeast Asia, Indonesia is bigger than all other Southeast Asian countries combined. Indonesia poses and will always pose a problem analogous to that faced by Europe after Bismarck united various German-speaking polities in 1871 to form Germany, a potential source of instability in the heart of a region. In Europe, it took 2 world wars and a Cold War to find an equilibrium. Southeast Asia was wiser, or perhaps we were just luckier. A confluence of events from the mid-1960s created a window that made ASEAN viable as a solution to the problems of Indonesia and Singapore. And that solution was to envelop both of us in an idea of Southeast Asia characterized by embracing the reality of diverse, even competing nationalisms, rather than struggling to overcome them. And this generated, too, the political will among its members to hold ASEAN together in its fragile first decade. Now, what was those events, that confluence of events? Well, by 1966, Suharto's new order had brought Indonesia more into alignment with those Southeast Asian countries that saw the Cold War conflicts in Indochina as threats. Sukarno's Indonesia had a somewhat romantic idea of North Vietnam as paralleling Indonesia's own experience. A year before, in 1965, the American escalation of the Vietnam War raised fears of its spread and the entanglement of other Southeast Asian countries to a new level. And this enhanced the attractiveness of regional organization as a buffer. And 4 years later, Richard Nixon's 1969 Guam speech made clear that regional states would have to take greater responsibility for their own security, lending urgency to efforts to stabilize non-communist Southeast Asia. In 1973, the US withdrew from South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, leaving them to their fates. In 1975, all of Indochina fell to communism. This was a shock equivalent to that Mr. Trump has administered on Europe by making clear his intention to stop the Ukraine war even at Kiev's expense. Southeast Asia went through it half a century earlier. It brought a new focus and sense of purpose to ASEAN, which had managed to hold together, but was nevertheless still drifting rather than setting clear directions for itself. All the 5 original ASEAN members were anti-communist, even if they professed non-alignment. All 5 had faced violence from communist insurgents or subversives. In 1976, a year after Indochina fell, ASEAN held its first summit in Bali and signed the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, which was open to accession by other Southeast Asian countries. It was meant as a gesture to the new governments of Indochina. None showed the slightest interest. 2 years after the Bali summit, on Christmas Day 1978, Vietnam, with the Soviet Union at its back, invaded democratic Kampuchea, as Cambodia was then known, overthrew the Chinese-supported Khmer Rouge, and installed a puppet regime. This was another salutary shock to ASEAN. A newly reunited Vietnam had been speaking ominously about bringing what Hanoi called genuine independence to Southeast Asia. Its invasion of Cambodia and installation of a puppet regime gave a sharper focus to ASEAN's fears and further urgency to ASEAN cooperation. 2 months after the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia, in February 1979, China invaded Vietnam. This initiated another fundamental shift of Cold War dynamics in Southeast Asia, which eventually led to Beijing dropping its support for Southeast Asian communist insurgencies and working with ASEAN to oppose the Vietnamese occupation of Cambodia. And this implied that China de facto accepted ASEAN's idea of regional order, although Beijing still retained its own ideas about what that regional order should be used for. Not ideal, but better than Beijing's previous position, which was to oppose ASEAN. I still remember, because I was at Columbia at that time, I still remember the bewilderment of an American friend, a student at Columbia Journalism School, where we are this evening, at my response when he brought me the news of China invading Vietnam, excitedly waving the New York Times. I told him I had not thought that China would do us such a big favor and that ASEAN would now probably be all right. His bewildered response taught me something about the naivete of some Americans about power. The Vietnamese invasion and occupation of Kampuchea or Cambodia was a Sino-Soviet proxy conflict. It was beyond ASEAN's strategic weight to find a solution to a big boys game. A solution had to await a shift in what the Soviet Union used to call the global configuration of forces. But for the entire decade of the 1990s, ASEAN played a secondary but nevertheless critical diplomatic role in preventing a Vietnamese fait accompli, so that when the configuration of forces did finally shift after Gorbachev came to power and started to retrench Soviet overextensions to concentrate on perestroika, a solution involving an act of self-determination for Cambodia was still possible. Only months after the Second Paris Conference on Cambodia in October 1991 finalized a peace agreement that led to the withdrawal of Vietnamese troops and UN-supervised elections in Cambodia, the Soviet Union imploded and the Cold War was over. I do not intend to describe all the twists and turns of ASEAN's diplomacy on the Cambodian issue during the 1980s, except to say that the greatest complexities were not dealing with adversaries, not dealing with the Soviet Union or Vietnam or its allies. The greatest complexities were managing intra-ASEAN differences. But I cannot overemphasize how crucial that decade was in ASEAN's evolution. Holding together despite numerous and sometimes bitter tactical disagreements, standing our ground not just against adversaries, but also against China, the US, and Europe, who are all ostensibly on our side, but sometimes acted otherwise. I can tell you stories during question time about what Americans did. And more often than not, prevailing or forcing these much stronger countries to compromise gave ASEAN confidence in its own agency. Success won ASEAN international respect and made ASEAN's partners take it seriously. Apart from Japan and Australia, other partners have been polite rather than deeply engaged in their dealings with ASEAN prior to ASEAN showing what it could do when pressed. An entire generation of ASEAN diplomats, myself included, learned our trade during that decade. Ladies and gentlemen, I've taken quite some time, perhaps too long, sketching the history of the evolution of ASEAN and the idea of Southeast Asia. I did so because I am convinced that it is impossible to understand contemporary Southeast Asia and its ability to cope with a new iteration of great power rivalries without the historical background. Too much superficial and just plain wrong assessments are made because the region's history is forgotten or ignored, including by too many Southeast Asians themselves. Let me now suggest what lessons we can take from the history I sketched in order to better understand ASEAN and the challenges it faces as it navigates an increasingly complex strategic environment. There are two broad lessons. First, given the tensions and suspicions between different variants of Southeast Asian nationalisms, it took the strong and sustained external stimulus of the Cold War and Sino-Soviet rivalry to foster regional cooperation. That it was obviously to everyone's advantage to cooperate was not enough. If the Cold War and Sino-Soviet rivalry had not turned violent in Southeast Asia, in other words, it was kinetic conflict, not just Cold War, I doubt ASEAN would have been formed, or if formed, would have survived and prospered. And even then, it took regime change in Indonesia to align all our fears in the same direction. Competition being an inherent characteristic of relations between sovereign states and human nature being what it is, organizing against something is almost always easier than organizing for something. Although they viewed attempts to contain communism in Southeast Asia with various degrees of skepticism, the original 5 ASEAN members all opposed communism. Singapore, for example, did not think the US would succeed in Vietnam, but was nevertheless grateful and encouraged it to persevere, to try, because it bought time for us and other non-communists to put our own houses in order. So it was not an entirely wasted effort. Moscow and Beijing's criticisms of ASEAN as a disguised SEATO were not entirely unwarranted. In spirit, if not always in action, ASEAN was a product of the Cold War. This raises a very fundamental, potentially existential question. If you are, however loosely, a Cold War organization, what do you do when the Cold War is over? The obvious answer is to do what you claim was your purpose all along: economic cooperation. The Bangkok Declaration, ASEAN's founding document, said nothing about political or security matters, these being deemed too sensitive. It focused instead on economic, cultural, and other non-controversial forms of cooperation, almost everything under the sun, except what had really brought ASEAN together, leading Mr. S. Rajaratnam, Singapore's first foreign minister, to once quip, and I quote, It was a very difficult problem of trying to say nothing in about 10 pages, which we did. Some half-hearted attempts at cooperating on industrial projects and establishing a preferential trade arrangement were made during the 1970s and 1980s. They did not amount to very much. The economies of most ASEAN members were as much or more competitive than complementary, or at least their leaders and officials believed them to be so. This is still largely the case. Although Mr. Trump's imposition of very high levels of tariffs on several ASEAN members ought to incentivize greater economic cooperation among ASEAN members, and we can expect rhetorical calls to accelerate, broaden, and deepen economic cooperation as a response to the tariffs. In fact, they have already started. Mr. Trump's tariffs are, at least in the short to medium term, in my judgment, more likely to deepen the competitive dynamic as states rush to try and gain exemptions in the context of a softening world economy. The difficulties of economic cooperation again illustrates that it's easier to organize against something rather than for something, even when the benefits of the latter are clear. Post-Cold War globalization nevertheless offered opportunities, and ASEAN has set ever more ambitious goals for reducing barriers to goods, services, capital, and skilled labor in order to make Southeast Asia a single market and a single production base. There has been some progress. ASEAN likes to speak of itself as a market of 700 million and the world's 5th largest economy. The reality, however, is that Southeast Asia is still 10 separate economies and is likely to remain so for the foreseeable future. Growth in Southeast Asia is almost all due to national policies and national efforts. ASEAN's contribution is mainly indirect, providing the stability that makes growth possible. There is usually a problem when trying to assess regional economic cooperation of deciding whether the glass is half empty or half full. But what is for sure in ASEAN's case is that the filling the glass has been fitful and slow. ASEAN has been much better at formulating plans than implementing them. There is always a large performative element in ASEAN's plans. Now, this is not due to any particular perverseness on the part of its members. I have to say that since I was one of the officials. Opening markets or linking markets is always politically difficult, even when the benefits and the necessity of doing so are clear. But there are two factors that made it more than usually difficult in post-Cold War Southeast Asia. The first factor is that the post-Cold War expansion of membership to include Cambodia, Myanmar, Laos, and Vietnam. That's the first factor. While expansion was desirable or at any rate inevitable and is now irreversible, it has enhanced what I earlier called the paradox of diversity, and not just in economics. It is obviously easier for 5 or 6 countries to reach consensus than 10, but that is not the real issue. The 5 original members had different strategic outlooks and hence different calculations of national interest, which sometimes involved issues that were of crucial importance to the countries concerned. But they nevertheless were usually able to reconcile their interests to reach consensus. The real problem is that expansion was undertaken almost casually, without sufficient preparation or even sufficient thought about how the new members were to be socialized into ASEAN mores. The only consideration was how to deal with the lower level of economic development of the new members. But that was seen largely as a technical issue and was in any case not the core of the problem of expansion. The 5 original members and Brunei after it joined understood very clearly that once ASEAN was formed, calculations of national interest had to contain some element of the regional interest. The regional interest is not always the main or most important element in the calculus of interest. In many, or if not most matters, the regional interest is not a first-order consideration because ASEAN is an interstate organization with very limited supranational ambitions and national considerations always come first. But the understanding was that there must always be some element of the regional interest in national calculations. And that understanding is weak in all new members except Vietnam. It remains weak even though expansion of membership occurred more than 20 years ago. The second factor, which accentuates the impact of the first factor, is that the domestic politics of all 10 ASEAN members have become more pluralist and hence complicated as they developed economically. It pleases some observers to call this democratization. I prefer to call it the pluralization of politics, but I'm not going to quarrel about semantics. It is a fact that Western democracies have not been very effective at decision-making because of the range of interests and opinions that have to be accommodated. In Southeast Asia, the complications of politics that have become more pluralist do not manifest themselves or play out in the same way in every ASEAN member, but they cannot be ignored in any member. This has not only made reaching internal consensus more difficult, but it has also privileged short-term political imperatives over long-term calculations. The degree to which this has occurred varies from country to country, but it is never entirely absent in the domestic decision-making of every country. It has made taking hard decisions harder. When ASEAN was able to act decisively, the internal politics of none of its members could be described as democratic, as the term is understood in the West, or in my preferred terminology, they were all far less pluralist than today. Some held fair elections or reasonably fair elections, but all were in some degree what the West would call authoritarian. Again, if it pleases anyone to use that term, I'm not going to quibble with them, nor am I advocating a return to the past. That is neither desirable nor possible. But it cannot be denied that authoritarian systems, because the range of interests and opinions they have to accommodate is narrower, they are better placed to take hard decisions and pursue them over the long term. However, it is also a fact that this is an advantage only if the decision was the correct one in the first place. You know the old Chinese saying, a journey of 1,000 li begins with a single step. It has to be a single step in the right direction. ASEAN was lucky that its early leaders made the right decisions. That is less evident today. It is not only that subsequent leaders were all less intellectually capable. That's not true, although undoubtedly some were not the brightest bulbs. They had other talents, ruthlessness and cunning perhaps, that brought them to power. But whether intelligent or otherwise, their decisions had to be based on different considerations than earlier generations of leaders because their political environments had become more complicated. This is a new reality that cannot be avoided, but consensus decision-making cannot be abandoned. Decision-making by consensus is the logical consequence of what I identified as ASEAN's primary purpose, the management of intra-ASEAN relationships and the tensions between different nationalisms. Deciding by consensus reassures the small that the big will not impose their will on them. Equally, it reassures the big that the small will not gang up against them. Any other modality of decision-making risks small differences escalating into major problems or even conflict. Decision-making by consensus and its corollary, non-interference in the internal affairs of members, has often been modified in practice, but it cannot be abandoned as a principle. It is slow, it is inefficient, it often results in the lowest common denominator setting the pace. It means some decisions are avoided and too many are merely performative. But this is the price we pay for having any sort of regional organization at all in an imperfect world. And it is a price well worth paying if you contrast the state of Southeast Asia in 1967 with the state of Southeast Asia today. It was not for nothing that we were then commonly referred to as the Balkans of Asia. Today we have our problems, which region is without problems, and most international issues do not lend themselves to definitive solutions, but can only be managed. Still, by and large, Southeast Asia is at peace with itself and the world. ASEAN, for all its imperfections, has proven to be a not ineffective tool for managing intra-Southeast Asian problems and blunting the sharpest edges of intra-regional differences, even if it cannot erase them. The question that confronts us now is how to keep it this way. Well, we are what we are, and for reasons I hope I have made clear, ASEAN is unlikely to change in any fundamental way. It is a product of the history of a particular region. We have to work with the tools that is at hand. And as I have very often had to tell critics of ASEAN, it is utterly pointless to criticize a cow for being an imperfect horse. And that is what many criticisms of ASEAN amount to. The new realities I just outlined make an external spur to sustain cooperation and even more crucial than before, because post-Cold War dynamics accentuate what I call the diversity dilemma. US-China strategic competition has replaced US-Soviet rivalry, and what Moscow and Beijing call a partnership without limits has replaced Sino-Soviet rivalry. But neither can provide the kind of external stimulus towards cohesion that ASEAN needs, because neither is regarded as the kind of threat that US-Soviet or Sino-Soviet rivalry posed during a different era. No one can today credibly entertain the hope or fear that communism will triumph in Southeast Asia. That's over. Maoist China was clearly a threat to the original 5 ASEAN members and Brunei. It was regarded with great suspicion by Burma, or Myanmar as it's now called. Attitudes towards post-Mao China are no longer as clear-cut. Repeated surveys of Southeast Asian opinion have shown that while China's influence is acknowledged, it is also deeply mistrusted. By virtue of its contiguity, its size, and its economic weight, China will always enjoy significant influence in Southeast Asia. It is a geopolitical fact and an extremely important economic partner that we must somehow deal with, and we prefer to deal with it by positive engagement. But for precisely the same reasons, contiguity, size, and economic weight, as well as its aggressive behavior in the South China Sea and towards Taiwan, China also arouses anxieties about engagement compromising our autonomy. China's influence tends to be more emphasized because it is more visible, but the anxieties it arouses are as real. This has resulted in a quiet but significant shift of attitudes towards the US military presence in Southeast Asia as a necessary balance to China that allows us to engage China positively without compromising our sovereignty. There have also always been concerns about American behavior, of course, and doubts about US reliability have been endemic in Southeast Asia for half a century, ever since the Nixon Doctrine and the withdrawal from Vietnam. The Nixon Doctrine and the abandonment of South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia have not been forgotten in Southeast Asia, even as countries improve defense ties with the US and its allies. As such countries that are improving defense ties with the US include old enemy Vietnam, and a country which still has a very strong non-aligned tradition, Indonesia. Now, such doubts about America's reliability have certainly risen after Trump returned to power, but long predate this administration. Both the new appreciation of the indispensable UL role in maintaining balance and endemic questions about its reliability are part of Southeast Asian reality. The West tends to lump China and Russia into one category of authoritarian, largely because of China's support for Russian aggression against Ukraine. Southeast Asia does not accept such a simplistic categorization. Russia is not a significant strategic player in Southeast Asia, but even Singapore, which has taken a strong position on Ukraine and imposed our own sanctions on Moscow, sees no advantage in shunning Russia and continues with bilateral exchanges. Ukraine is not a bilateral issue for us, and not for any other Southeast Asian country vis-a-vis Russia. Other countries have even more nuanced positions on Ukraine and relations with Russia, in particular the Muslim majority countries who see Western double standards at play in the contrast between Western responses to Ukraine and Gaza. For instance, Malaysia will conduct very high-level visits to Russia later this year. Malaysia is the current chair of ASEAN. This brings me to the second broad lesson from the history I recounted. Even during the height of the Cold War and Sino-Soviet rivalry, the countries of Southeast Asia have never looked at their choices in a binary way. This is even more so today. I am constantly surprised at the apparent difficulty many otherwise astute commentators, not solely but particularly in the West, have in grasping this simple and to me perfectly obvious fact. I have often written about this, and so will be brief because we are running out of time and also because I'm sick of repeating myself. Details for anyone interested during question time, please. When we say, as we perhaps do too often, that we do not want to choose in the context of US-China rivalry, what we really mean is that we do not conceive of our choices in a binary way, just as between Washington and Beijing. We mean that we will exercise our agency, and even the smallest state in the most dire of circumstances always has some agency. Otherwise, I would not be here talking to you, because Singapore, as we know it today, would not exist. We always have an agency, some agency to follow our interests in whatever direction they may take us. And we see no need whatsoever to neatly line up all our ducks in one direction or another. This prescribes an omnidirectional foreign policy. I was going to say that South Asian foreign policy is always polygamous and never monogamous, but these are politically correct times, so I didn't say that. We may balance with one major power in one domain, bandwagon with another power or several other powers in a different domain, hedge with several others in other domains. And what we do does not foreclose working with other powers, even rival powers, in some other way in the same domain. For example, all the ASEAN countries, the main ones anyway, conduct defense exercises which are increasing in sophistication and size with the US and its allies. But they also conduct defense exercises of a lower level of sophistication with China, and even just before the invasion of Ukraine, the first ever naval exercise with Russia. Balancing, hedging, and bandwagoning are distinct strategies only in international relations theory, which is one of the reasons why I quit the PhD. In practice, Southeast Asian countries see no difficulty in doing all simultaneously. To paraphrase the great American novelist F. Scott Fitzgerald, who in this respect is a better guide to Southeast Asian statecraft than many a political scientist or historian, we have no difficulty functioning while holding two or more contradictory ideas in our heads. This is how we usually function. As a strategic crossroads between two crucial oceans through which pass vital sea lines of communication, Southeast Asia is a naturally multipolar region in that almost always throughout its history, there have been several powers contending for influence. Southeast Asia statecraft has been honed over centuries of having to live and survive in such an environment. I do not claim that we always function very well, but this is in principle what we try to do when advancing or protecting our interests. And the key word here, which I've used throughout this talk, is agency. You are never entirely without it, although whether you have the wit to recognize opportunities to exercise agency in any set of circumstances, and even if you recognize the opportunities, whether you have the courage and capability to seize them are, of course, different matters. But agency is always there. Efforts to exercise agency may not always succeed, or not succeed to the extent we may hope. But our history teaches us that not trying to use whatever agency you possess is always disastrous. I earlier mentioned that with two very tragic exceptions, nationalism helped countries in Southeast Asia successfully navigate the risks of the Cold War. The two exceptions are Royalist Laos and Prince Sihanouk's Cambodia. To avoid getting entangled in the Vietnam War, who can blame them? But anyway, to avoid getting entangled, they first adopted a neutrality of a rather passive kind, laying low, offending no one, and hoping to be left alone. When this did not work, neutrality is not something you can unilaterally adopt, but has to be respected by others. And during the Vietnam War, nobody respected anybody's neutrality. They sought protection from the US. In both cases, they surrendered what agency they had to external parties, with the sad results we know. The Pathet Lao were not as murderous as the Khmer Rouge, but bad enough. To think that concerns about the US will automatically rebound to China's advantage, as too many commentators predict, is condescending nonsense. A particularly insulting variant is that China's economic weight and growing trade, investments, and aid, not to mention what I shall delicately refer to as informal transfers, will align Southeast Asia with China. It assumes that we are all so stupid as not to know our own interests, or all so venal as to sell them for a mess of pottage. Straight line projections from economic relations to political influence are always simplistic, and I have had occasion to remind Chinese friends that even the very corrupt can be nationalists. The will to exercise agency stems from nationalism, which I had earlier identified as the most powerful force in modern Southeast Asia. The two countries where nationalism is strongest are Indonesia and Vietnam. These are also the largest countries in Southeast Asia. Without control of Indonesia and Vietnam, no external power can capture Southeast Asia. This is not to say there are no risks. Maintaining an omnidirectional foreign policy requires not just agility, but more crucially, the ability to make clinical, indeed cold-blooded and ruthless assessments of interests, regional as well as national interests. This ability is being degraded by the more complex domestic politics of key ASEAN members. The ASEAN position on Myanmar exemplifies this unfortunate trend. When the coup occurred in February 2021, ASEAN leaders quickly met and adopted a 5-point consensus that in essence outlined the steps they expected that the State Administration Council, or SAC, as the regime set up by the Tatmadaw, the Myanmar military, called itself, they set out their expectations, what they needed to do in order to return the country to normalcy. The coup leader, Senior General Min Aung Hlaing, was present but did not object. It was correct for ASEAN leaders to have set out their expectations of acceptable behavior by a member. The fact that the ASEAN had done nothing when the Thai military staged a coup in 2014 was passed over in discreet silence. Thailand is a much more important member of ASEAN than Myanmar, and double standards are unavoidable in diplomacy, and the Thai king had ex post facto offered a fig leaf of approval to the coup. Never mind that this was constitutionally beyond his authority. But it was unrealistic, totally unrealistic, for ASEAN to expect the Tatmadaw to, for instance, enter into political dialogue with its opponents and refrain from using force against them as required by the 5 points. Well, if the Tatmadaw was the kind of organization that was prepared to do such things, such nice things, it would not have staged a coup in the first place. Senior General Min Aung Hlaing's lack of objection was not consent. The 5 points were aspirational and performative, a posture rather than a policy. Now, posturing is a perfectly legitimate diplomatic tactic. For example, votes in the UN General Security Council, votes on UN General Assembly's resolutions are postures, expressions of aspirations towards certain types of conduct, or that certain principles be adopted as international norms. As the countries that make those votes often have neither the capability nor the intention to implement their votes. And in any case, UNGA resolutions are not binding. But to insist that ASEAN did that the SAC be barred from attending ASEAN political meetings until it complied with the 5 points was to take matters far too far. ASEAN has neither carrots nor sticks to influence the Tatmadaw. It can only talk to it. And if you refuse to let the SAC attend your meetings, why should it talk to you? By confusing a posture for a policy, ASEAN only made itself look ineffectual. Posturing on a moral high horse may make you feel good for a while, but it is not very comfortable and does not make for an edifying spectacle. By contrast, when the Tatmadaw, then in power after an earlier coup, exercised large-scale violence against a civilian uprising in 1988, ASEAN had, against sustained Western pressures, patiently engaged it for decades, and even allowed Myanmar to join ASEAN in 1997 until the Tatmadaw gained enough confidence to loosen its grip and allow fairly genuine elections in 2010. The 2021 decision to exclude the SAC was clearly driven by short-term domestic political considerations primarily in Indonesia and Malaysia, but unfortunately and sadly, Singapore joining them. Thailand, which has had a series of weak governments since Thaksin was ousted in 2006, was ineffective in injecting a greater sense of realism into ASEAN's approach. It was a particularly ineffective government and an ineffective foreign minister at that time. I spent some time on Myanmar because the consequences of allowing domestic considerations to determine strategic policies was not just to make ASEAN look foolish. If that was all, it would not matter very much. But Myanmar has begun to split ASEAN. Bangkok has gone its own way to engage the SAC. This was entirely predictable because Thailand, with a 2,400-kilometer border with Myanmar, and perhaps up to 2 million or more Myanmar refugees and illegal immigrants, cannot afford to posture indefinitely. The emerging split reinforces a long-standing divisions between mainland and maritime Southeast Asia, and the different strategic calculations of Mekong riparian states and those states who look to the seas, the former looking more naturally northwards towards China than the latter. Vietnam is caught in between because the Mekong and the South China Sea are both important to it. But Laos and Cambodia, who are never comfortable with the hardline ASEAN position on Myanmar, will drift in Thailand's direction. Unless ASEAN finds a face-saving way to get off its Myanmar high horse in good time, the split between mainland and maritime Southeast Asia will widen. ASEAN will still exist as an organization. Its members will continue to try to maintain omnidirectional foreign policies, but the geopolitical consequences of a split between mainland and maritime at a time of strategic uncertainty are potentially very grave. The risk arising from ASEAN's mishandling of the Myanmar issue underscores the dangers of soft-headed or sentimental thinking and confusing feeling good for actually doing good. Ladies and gentlemen, I've spoken for far too long, so I'll wrap up here. But I do not want you to leave with the impression that I think Southeast Asia future is totally bleak. There are real problems that will complicate our ability with the difficult times that lie ahead, but there is no a priori reason to think that we will not survive. Southeast Asia is resilient and adaptable. We have gone through far worse with far less diplomatic, economic, and military capabilities than we now command, and not merely survived, but prospered. For Southeast Asia, the path ahead will get steeper and rockier, but will still be navigable. We will adapt to Mr. Trump's policies and have already begun to do so. Unfortunately, however, that may not be the end of the story. In geopolitics, in my view, Mr. Trump is more a catalyst than anything else. I use the term catalyst in the sense of something that speeds up processes. The geopolitical disruptions he has caused in his first term and at present arise from the acceleration and thus the accentuation of geopolitical adjustments that were already underway before either his first or second terms as president. The risks they generate are what Donald Rumsfeld called known unknowns. But the changes he's trying to force on the world through tariffs take us into the realm of unknown unknowns. It is not certain that he will succeed in all of what he says he wants to do. He seems to see tariffs as a kind of a Swiss Army knife, a universal tool to pursue multiple goals. But regardless of whether he succeeds or fails, at some point, trade and geopolitics, the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns could merge, hypercharging uncertainties. Still, we should never despair. It is pointless to just complain that our cheese is no longer where we were accustomed to find it, and I don't think we will do so. Barring a catastrophic event such as a kinetic and not just a trade war between the US and China, which seems unlikely given nuclear deterrence, I am not clairvoyant, but I am reasonably confident that ultimately, after as many or more hesitations, false starts, dead ends, and meanderings as those from which ASEAN emerged almost 60 years ago, the uncertainties Mr. Trump has generated will lead to a broader East Asian structure that will afford more scope and maneuver space to the small countries of Southeast Asia. And on that, I admit somewhat cryptic note, I shall end. I'm happy to take your questions, but not before reminding you that the only official title I now hold is that of pensioner. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak to you and for listening so patiently to me. Thank you. Me in the middle. Underneath and
So you can exercise your agency. This is
oh yeah.
Put up your mic there.
Yeah.
everyone. It is a true pleasure to be hosting this event along with Weatherhead, and I think part of the purpose of this annual lecture series is really to get into the history of what regional institutions do. They are these Cold War institutions, these legacies. We study the artificiality of regions, but also all the geopolitics and the history that informed the making of a region. And so I think today's lecture really encapsulated, I think, the spirit and tradition of the series. I couldn't help, Ambassador, but be struck by some
Pensioner, not ambassador. No more, no more.
we're writing that degree.
Okay.
Sir. But we have an organization formed for geopolitical reasons, right? In response to conflicts that endured tensions as a result of expansion, right? And also whose internal politics, right, was very different in the later stages than it was in the formative stages, right? And all of these factors you put out there as possibly eroding some of its coherence. And I think you end on this optimistic note about multipolarism and agency within all of this uncertainty, chaos, Trumpism, rivalry, and so forth. But what if this is a 1989 moment as opposed to a continuation of multipolarity moment? What if, rather than being able to leverage competition, Moscow, Beijing, and now Washington decide to divide the world up into 3 different spheres, and Mr. Trump gets Greenland, it gets to act in a predatory fashion towards the Americas, Mr. Putin is ceded Ukraine, and then Beijing is given a green light, perhaps in Taiwan, perhaps to exert a sphere of influence. What is the agency there, and what would the reactions be to, and how likely or unlikely is this scenario?
Well, I can't say this scenario is impossible, because nothing is impossible. It is not impossible that as we sit here, a meteor will come through the ceiling and kill us all. It's not very probable, but it's not impossible. Now, I don't think this is a very likely scenario. It's not impossible for a number of reasons. The first is, if you look at, it's still early days, huh? It's only about 3 months old.
It's more like 3 months.
I know it feels longer, but it's only 3 months. We have to keep reminding yourself of that, right? But what he has done in these 3 months, you mentioned some of them, trying to force a settlement, I won't call it peace, or a pause in fighting in Ukraine, even at Ukraine's expense, trying to get to monopolize the strategic minerals that are in Greenland, in Ukraine, in Canada, trying to bring manufacturing back to the United States. Whether he succeeds or not, and I think at best he will only partially succeed in all these things, they can be read, they can be interpreted as preparing for a long-term strategic competition with China. Right? That's not the only possible interpretation, I grant you, but it is an alternative interpretation to your interpretation. We shall just have to see. But there's another factor. There's a personality factor, and that's much more subjective, and it's much more hard to assess. Mr. Trump believes he is the greatest deal maker in the history of the universe. That's clear. And he loves to make deals, but I think he loves to win even more. And a division of the world, as you suggest, would be a clear loss for the United States because Asia is the most fast, is still, and I think will still be, despite Mr. Trump's best efforts, one of the fastest growing regions of the world for the foreseeable future. So why should he give it up? If he does give it up, he will be seen to be a loser and one that was bamboozled by China. I don't think he wants that. But anyway, I reserve my judgment, and I don't think everything he says about China so far tells me or can be interpreted as preparing for some long-term competition and striking a deal, but I think it will be primarily an economic deal, a trade deal. And even that, it will be within fairly narrow boundaries. I don't see him giving up. We talked about this a bit, Andy. I don't see him giving up the restrictions on the transfer of certain kinds of technologies to China, because that's an American competitive advantage. The Chinese have made great strides, that is true, and they'll probably make greater strides. But the implementation of those breakthroughs still rests on a foundation of American technology, particular semiconductor technology at the high end, right? So I don't see him giving that up. If he cuts a deal, it'll be a trade deal. He'll probably start from the premise, hey, you didn't even fulfill the 1920 deal. So let's talk about that first before we talk about anything else. And I want more now, right? But he will, of course, present it as the greatest deal in the universe, in the history of deal making. But we'll see. I don't know. I don't know. I can't say for sure, but I don't buy your scenario.
Okay.
So your theory of Trump gives him more credit for being smart than we are inclined to do. But let's say you're right. Would you say then that he is objectively weakening the American hand in this long-term strategic competition by destroying, you say that allies are always suspicious of each other. That's true, but never like now. The allies are rationally suspicious. American economic power is declining, and on and on and on. So is there a risk that the United States, while preparing for strategic competition and weakening, by the way, our scientific base and our best universities, damn it,
All right.
right? Don't you think that let's put it this way, I don't want to be too polemical. Are the people in Southeast Asia concerned that the United States will lose its capacity to serve as a counterbalance to China in the region?
Okay. That's a very good question.
Thank you, sir.
I think people are thinking about it, and I think if you ask different people, you'll get different answers. I'll give you my answer. When I came to Colombia years ago, that was the first time I ever set foot in the United States of America. And the summer of 1977-78 was not the best. New York in the summer of 1977-1978 was not the best introduction to America. And the Upper West Side and Morningside was not the best introduction to Manhattan either. All right? I think all of you who are, maybe the young people in this room don't know what I'm talking about. Well, you certainly do, Andy, you, Tom, and I'm sure you do, right? But here we are. Rejuvenation is not a Chinese monopoly. If you look at Times Square then, and you look at Times Square now, it's almost prissy. Right? Now, that's my point. The two things I learned about the United States at Columbia University, which I retain to this day, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to learn them, are first of all, a taste for bourbon. And secondly, I realized, and this is not a thought that comes naturally to anybody from East or Asia, including Southeast Asia, that America was founded by people who really did not trust government too much, and therefore made central government weak as possible. In all Asian political cultures, East Asian, Southeast Asian, Northeast Asian, good government is equated with strong central government. But I realized that is not true in this country. And I also realized that the essential sources of American strength, resilience, and creativity do not reside in Washington, D.C. People from Washington, D.C. will vehemently deny that. They actually reside in your civic institutions, in universities, in research laboratories, in Wall Street, in corporations. Now, Trump is weakening them, right?
And bring you here to be optimistic, man.
Wait. I will revert to Singapore side and be pessimistic. So, and all these, and that is the essential source of your strength. Now, it takes some time to manifest. It is being damaged, but I believe it will rejuvenate. Now, how long is where my Singaporean pessimism comes in? How long, we cannot say. We do not know. There may be quick corrections, because you can already hear rumblings within Mr. Trump's camp, shall we say, whether on the Hill or in the private sector, that hey, boss, this is not what we signed up for, right? And Mr. Trump, the good thing about being totally transactional like Mr. Trump and totally shameless is that you can turn on a dime and say, this is what I wanted to do all along. He finds no difficulty in doing that. He's done it before, right? So I am not so pessimistic. I'm not so optimistic. And his calculation is a very simple one. Actually, a lot of the things he's doing, at least in the geopolitical field, I make a difference between the trade. Trade is really going to new territory. But in the geopolitical field, as I said, he is actually accelerating existing tendencies. I remember when I was at Columbia, I stumbled across, again, while I was supposed to be studying something else, the works of this American theologian and political philosopher, Reinhold Niebuhr. Am I pronouncing it right? And I remember reading in one of his works, I think it was Moral Man and Immoral Society, that, Americans being fundamentally uncomfortable with power, when they exercise power in pursuit of their interests, feel it necessary and believe in the necessity of wrapping it up in some idea of higher moral significance or wider moral significance. What Mr. Trump has done is rather brutally rip that wrapping off. Look, all the things I said, he did not invent skepticism towards regional institutions and multilateral institutions. It's always been there. He did not invent unilateralism. Remember Mr. Richard Nixon, overnight on the 15th of August, I believe, 1971, destroying a central pillar of the Bretton Woods system by taking the American dollar off the gold peg without telling anybody, not consulting a single ally, and throwing Europe into chaos. Remember the Vietnam War when, you cut and ran. Well, you may have forgotten, we haven't. In other words, what I'm trying to say, the shining city on a hill has always cast a dark shadow. You guys live on the hill, so the shadow is not evident to you. We have always lived below the hill, so we have been conscious about it. And that is why we have always dealt with America on the basis of common interests and not deluded ourselves that we share common values. I can understand why Americans are very upset. Americans like you, like all the people in this room. If I were you, I would be upset too. All right? But I'm not you. We have never, ever, all Southeast Asia, including some of your Asian allies, never regarded American democracy with uncritical admiration, and we have never recoiled in horror from all variants of authoritarianism. We have our own interests. He's going to damage some interests of ours, for sure. He's already done so. This 10% across the board tariff plus, good God, thing is going to slow growth for all of us. It's going to be particularly bad for a country like Singapore because world growth is going to slow, right? And you may or may not know, trade to GDP, the proportion is 300 times our GDP. There's no country in the world that has a larger proportion. Now, there are only 3 growth centers in the world, major ones, right? There's China, which is slowing down for its own internal reasons, and I don't think it's going to get back to very high growth rates. And this new tariffs, this is not going to help China. Europe is in some deep trouble. It's so deep trouble, they are only beginning to realize how deep the trouble they are in. And Europe cannot recover economically until Germany recovers, and that will take quite some time. Because Europe now cannot spend everything on social spending and neglect defense. They have to do both. And that's going to be very painful. So who's left as a growth locomotive? It's only the US. And if Trump damages the US economy, and every economist seems to think so, except Peter Naravo, I don't often agree with Mr. Musk, but when he said that this guy is a moron, I tend to agree. In fact, I've never agreed with Elon Musk, except this one time. All right. Now, he has ripped the wrapping off the reality of American power. And I think his calculation is a very simple, even simplistic one, but at least in the short term, it's not a wrong one, right? His calculation is, hey, you guys in Europe, you guys in Asia, you can't do without me, because you in Europe, you can't deal with Russia without me, at least minimally at your back. And you with Asia, even if you all combine, you cannot balance China. So what the hell, you better do as I tell you. That is true in the short to medium term. It will be true longer for Europe, because Europe has got itself in a more than usual muddle. But it's going to be true for some time in Asia too. Now, my last cryptic remark, let me try to elaborate that, right? If he hyper accelerates the uncertainties, as I fear he will do by merging the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns, what will we do? What is the natural Asian instinct? It's going to be to hedge, to find a new balance. And it's not going to be China, because China is the reason we need America. What is going to happen is that I think we are already on that trajectory. This will accelerate it. Japan and South Korea will become nuclear weapon states, independent with their independent deterrence, loosely within the American system, just like France and Britain. Now that will freeze a multipolar, multi-dimensional balance, nuclear balance of terror in East Asia. Now the road from where we are to there is going to be a very fraught and rocky one. But once we get there, I think it will be stabilizing. In any case, it will prevent any kind of Chinese hierarchy. So, and that kind of multipolar thing is good for small countries in Southeast Asia, because it creates maneuver space. There are 2 nightmare scenarios for us, for small countries. One is, of course, if the US and China go to war, then you have no room to exercise the agency. No. The other is, of course, if they agree on every damn thing, then you also have no room to exercise agency. So some measure of tension and some measure of the multipolarity that I think is going to the almost inevitable result of the uncertainties Mr. Trump is creating is good for us. We'll just have to get from here to there. And that's the hard part.
Well, we're really out of time, right, Alex?
Yeah, we've dismally failed in the one function we had.
So I think we have to...
My fault. Don't blame me.
Yeah.
Everybody does.
We have to leave it there. So thank you very much.